This week on the Fan Le Batard Show, we investigate the oral history. What really happened at Marc Hochman's sports comic event? Breaking it down for you next. Look, been wanting to do this episode since it came out. Been waiting for this episode. Been loving the oral history. Thought it's been great. And this episode delivered. And I wanted to take a deeper look. Because you know me. I can't remember if I even mentioned this because I did throw out an episode, Sports Proclamations. And I can't remember if that came out before or after Hochman's episode, but I think this is a great episode for all sorts of types of fans. You have fans like me who came in after ESPN days, never heard Hochman when he was on the actual show, have gone back and heard clips of Hochman. Oh man, tough. Powering through this cold makes it hard to talk. Got a scratch at the back of my throat constantly, but gonna do this, take a closer look here. But I think this is a great episode because you've got listeners who discovered Le Batard Show after ESPN are learning all about this history that previously I was not as aware on. And sorry, double headphoned up for the YouTube audience, seeing me pull out a AirPod out of the headphones I have on. Because you know what we're going to do, folks? This is what I did when I listened. I paused immediately when they started talking about Marc Hochman's sports comic and went and listened to it for myself to hear about the jokes. And so what I want to do now is let's break it down together. There's some things that were said that I want to investigate. Stu got saying like we knew it at the time that this was going to change their relationship. Mike echoed the same sentiments. Well, on this video you can see Mike Ryan, and guess what, there's multiple videos of this, and you can see Stu Gotts, you can see Dan during some of this. I'm going to show you stuff. You can hear Stu Gotts responding to some of the jokes in these videos. So we're going to break it down. Marc Hochman's sports comic was a bit they did on the show where he would do hacky jokes and roast athletes. I think first things first, as a ESPN listener, you got to know what was it like. So I have pulled up here, there's the Le Batard Show Archives YouTube channel has a 45-minute compilation. I'm going to play just a little bit of that so we can hear what was the sports comic like on the show and compare that to the actual roast of, because that's what he roasted athletes. His jokes were roasts of the athletes, and at the actual event he roasted Dan and Stu and other athletes as well too. That was the nature of the jokes that he did. So let's hear what those were like on the show here. So got it pulled up. Marc Hochman sports comic back in the day here.
Is feeling hollow today, haunted today, hungover today. Stinky feelings we got.
Yeah, it sure is. What do we do now?
People are saying I don't feel like laughing today, so I think that's the perfect introduction for someone who is not funny. Ladies and gentlemen, the awful sports comic.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big welcome to Marc Hochman sports comic.
Thank you, everybody. I know,
slowing it down there.
I know it's a tough day to come on out here and laugh today, but I
had it on a 2x speed because that's how I roll. We'll slow it down.
I appreciate you coming out. Definitely heartbreaking last night. I mean, it's very tough to defend LeBron. Unless you're the Mavericks. Hey, the good news is that LeBron's never going to get a DUI. He doesn't drive. LeBron would not be good in porn movies. He hates to penetrate. Seriously, though. All that nonsense about Dwayne Wade and LeBron
Stu
James
laughing in the
coughing,
background.
They weren't making fun of Dirk. They were just starting to choke early. Now, you know, and Dan and Stugatz can attest to this, I've been a big fan of Eddie House all season. Jeff Van Gundy, he just sang Eddie House's praise. I mean, I love the fact that he got some minutes last night. Nobody was more excited than me than Eddie House was playing. Except for Jason Terry. You know, I did find it a little curious, though, that they didn't go with Dexter Pittman last night. I mean, that guy has no problem with a zone. A Cal zone?
Ooh, weight gain
Why did you go
jokes.
damp there?
Well, Dexter Pittman has a weight problem.
He used to. He doesn't anymore.
See, but the thing is, Dan, when you switch teams and they pay you millions of dollars, the fans down here, they expect something better than what they're getting. But enough about Javi Vasquez.
Classic Javi.
There's more?
So, you know, the Marlins, they're 1-9 on their latest homestand. They enjoy being home as much as I do. I mean, my wife, I gotta tell you, she's not a good cook. Her specialty is indigestion. I'm Mark Hochman, sports comic.
here.
Night, night.
And there we go. You get the picture there. So hacky jokes, roasts, all of them roasts, right? Roasting the Miami Heat, roasting a player for his weight. So this becomes very popular with the Dan Le Batard Show audience and becomes an actual live event. How did this live event compare to what was done on the show? Because this is where everybody on the show, Hochman's like, man, I can't believe this is what blew it up. I'm doing these jokes as a character in front of an improv sign. And Dan takes it as disrespect, and both Mike and Stu talk about how, as it's happening, they could sense that this show's not going to be the same after this. So let's take a look here. I actually have two versions pulled up and gonna flip back and forth. I'm only gonna flip to one of them once here, and maybe we'll skip or stop at a certain point. For Dan, in the oral history, you heard the joke for him that stands out was the Nevin Shapiro joke, is learning about Hawk's resentments towards the show through this stand-up. Me personally, there's another joke in there that I'm gonna break down. But one thing here, let's go ahead. Let me pull up the actual thing here. So this one here is up close shot from somebody's phone, and is actually like at the table where all the heavy hitters are sitting. Samson, Stu Gotts, Ron McGill, Dan. You can actually hear people from the show responding to the jokes here. But the one that we're going to play the majority of the time, because it's better quality, it looks like this was done somewhat professionally, because the audio still wasn't great. It's not like they had the actual like audio from the microphone piped in. It is just like ambient noise still. So you can hear crowd. This one you hear more the crowd reactions. From the other one here, you can actually hear reactions of the show. And so there's actually a different sound to each of hearing people's reactions. But we're going to focus on the other one here. And let's pull it up, because guess what, folks? Let me just... Can I move myself here? Yes. I'm going to move myself over to this side right now, talking to the YouTube audience here, because, oh, excuse me, you guys, you're going to hear me sniffing and all that. You see here, this phone, this is the other YouTube video here, and this hat right here, ladies and gentlemen, is Dan Le Batard. And one thing want you to look at. Dan said, I remember being supportive during this. I was laughing and I was clapping above my head, letting Mark know that I was supporting him. Interesting little factoid by Dan. Like, he he remembers intentionally clapping above his hand. So let's see how many times does Dan clap above his hand. Now, this is, you see in the top corner, part 2. There is a part 1, but that's all introductions, really. There haven't been much of any jokes up into this point. It's all been some introductions, and Hochman, I believe, has already made his joke about his wife messing up a sandwich. So not that many jokes. I'm not going to go back because I don't want to flip back and forth between YouTube videos, but Dan Le Batard clapping above his head count 2 times so far. He's clapped above his head, but they're in response to introductions, not to jokes. So let's see how many times Dan claps above his head, and let's break down the jokes, shall we? Let's get into it here. Gonna play this.
Say that Dan's new TV show is going to be bad, but the working title is The Chris Volstad Show. There's like
I don't really get that joke. Chris Volstad, not sure. But moving on, seems like an ordinary roast joke. Got a good response from the audience.
watching, like half the people are getting it, other people are like, why do you take me here?
Yeah, not getting it.
And my wife is fucking up a sandwich.
Call back.
And it's not just me, the network doesn't have that much faith in Dan's show either. I've been told that in ESPN programming meetings, they're calling it pardon the cancellation.
Fine, PTI joke. Again, run-of-the-mill roast, and in line so far with Marc Hochman sports comic, except Dan is the target of his hackneyed roast jokes.
Is he laughing?
Checks in with Dan. Dan makes the joke, "You're fired." Laughing, though. So some back and forth between him and Dan, saying he's fired. Hochman laughing. And Mike giving a rim shot to Dan with a little bit of an awkward face doing it. So let's continue.
Dan's one of these sports writers that ESPN tries to force down our throats as experts. This is what they do now. They tell us Bill Simmons during the NBA Finals, he's an expert. Dan Le Batard's an expert. I don't trust Dan Le Batard as an expert for ESPN unless the E stood for ego. And the N for nachos.
And here's where we're actually going to switch over. So if you heard on the oral history, just burped in my mouth here, guys. Sorry, I'm gross. If you heard in the oral history, Stu was like, oh, as I'm listening to this, I could tell it was going to be different. Well, guess what? You can catch one of Stu Gott's reactions to the Marc Hochman joke in this other one. You can hear Stu, so let's come over. This is the same joke, but hearing Stu's reaction to it.
I don't trust Dan Le Batard as an expert for ESPN unless the E stood for ego. And the N for nachos.
So there's Stu. You're killing it, Hawk. You're killing it. Laughing. So perhaps at this point, it is a roast. He, as far as I know, did not roast Dan and Stu as the sports comic, stuck to sports. And I don't know if Dan and Stu, like, obviously based on everything we know, I don't think Dan and Stu went into this knowing they were going to be the main subjects of the roast here. I think it caught him off guard. But at least at this point here, maybe Stu's just doing what he does, support Hochman like he does during the bit. But maybe memory or we just haven't reached the jokes yet. Maybe memory is not the same as what Stu was actually thinking when this happened, and now little revisionist history, or we just haven't gotten to the jokes yet where Stu feels uncomfortable. And we are getting to maybe some more of the jokes that are on the edge. So let's get back over here to our other Marc Hochman comic here and get that queued up.
Only 37 more pages to go. Dan Le Batard has such a big ego, even Mary Bonds thinks he has a big head.
Again, I don't have any issues with these jokes, really. In terms of they're roast jokes. They're not that bad. They are focused on the show, but let's continue. They're hacky. They're similar to what he did on the show. Again, it's just Dan's the target.
Years ago. So Dan's starting this new TV show on ESPN in September, a daily television show on ESPN. Give him a hand. That's exciting. Stu Gatz and I are not part of it, though. We were not asked. We're still wishing him well, though. We're still wishing him well.
Awkward.
Even though we've done the radio show together for 8 years, and we all said that if it ever turned into a TV show, we'd do it together. Even though that happened, and Dan went and did the TV show without us, we are still rooting for him. Because the truth is, Dan is all about friendship and loyalty. He's our own personal Nevin Shapiro.
Again, there's the Nevin Shapiro joke. Mike clearly looks uncomfortable. Hawk's face, and like the setup to this and what comes next to me is kind of like Dan. It's a little like it's hard to not feel like Hochman isn't getting something off of his chest. Like there's things that are in there where like, Dan, you're all about friendship and loyalty, but we're not a part of it. And one thing within the oral history, like Marc Hochman is pretty adamant that he is, I was not offended that I was not a part of this show, right? Dan says, I think we offered him a producer role, and whoop, they cut to Hochman and he's like, no role was ever offered to me. It wasn't a big deal. If we go back in time, would I have taken a producer role on the TV show? I absolutely would have. Dan has it in his mind that Hochman wanted to be on the show, but turned down the producer role because he wanted a speaking role. Hochman says that was never offered to me. So you have contradicting versions of what happened. Marc Hochman saying, though, no big deal, doesn't bother me. And yet it seems like all the other people surrounding the show could sense this tension, right? But on top of this, like Dan has confused his timelines and thinks that he started highly questionable because he wanted something to fall back on in case Hochman and Stu left him. But that's not the case, right? He started the show before 2-a-days in the morning. So Dan's timeline of things, do not line up with what's actually happening in the timeline. So some people are misremembering, and honestly, like, I don't know how much I believe. I don't know anything about these people. I'm just a fan of this show, but it's hard to not think like that Hochman wasn't a little bit hurt about the TV show, and they were jokes and stuff, but he's taking pokes at Dan. And coming up for me, this is the joke that Dan mentions, but for me there's another joke that you keep it together, it feels like Hochman is making jokes, but he is kind of calling Dan out and saying, like, you're not the person who you think you are in terms of like this friendship, loyalty, family kind of thing. So let's listen just a little bit longer here and see what's coming up next.
And how about that little guy, huh? Taking everybody's
Grunting and groaning from the audience. Ooh.
money just so he can hang out with athletes. But enough about David Sampson. I was talking about that. A little early for that. Now, Dan, we're just kidding. We're just kidding. We are hoping your show does great. We're hoping you're the next George Lopez. You really can stop laughing. Dan's very different than me and Stu Gotts. After the show's
And here, this for me is the part where this goes beyond, in a sense, of a roast. And you get to see Dan's reaction to it the whole time, because they're going to cut back to Dan while Mark's doing it. For me, this is where it goes a little bit past, because it has nothing to do with the joke that he's setting it up. Like, he doesn't have to say this about Dan because it does not help him get to his joke. Like, he could have transitioned away off of Dan and made this joke without ever saying what he says about Dan. It's not needed, but it keeps with the theme that he's established in his roast of Dan of like, you're this guy who you don't really care about loyalty, friendship, or the fans. So maybe reading too much into it, but for me, this is where it goes, it was unnecessary.
Gotts and I, we will mingle with the crowd, we'll take drinks, have photos, we like that. Dan, you will find sprinting as fast as he can through the sovereign ancient land of the Seminole Indians as he looks for his sports car convertible so he can drive out of here without having to interact with any of you. He is very different than us, and even though this is the sovereign ancient land of the Seminole Indians, even they'll admit Jack McKeon was here first.
So there's the joke, a Jack McKeon joke that he's old, and the setup for it is Dan's going to get out of here and he's not going to try to like talk to any of you, which again comes right off the heels of the Nevin Shapiro joke of you're about all this loyalty. He's our own personal Nevin Shapiro. He doesn't really care about us. He's Dan's about himself. And the setup, he doesn't like, you could, hey, is everybody having a good time tonight here at the Sovereign? You know, even though we're here, Jack McKeon, see, he could get to the joke without his setup of Dan's going to leave here without trying to talk to any one of you. So I think that's as deep as we'll go. You can see Dan there during that. And for those of you keeping track at home, I could keep playing it and show you Dan he hasn't clapped once above his head in the time that I've shown you. And he was clearly like, there was some tension there while he's doing his setup for the Jack McKeon joke that you can see for Dan. This is the Dos Penguins video version on YouTube. If you just type in Marc Hochman sports comic, it's going to pop up. You can even see people have been watching it since the oral history. So what do we take away from this? Again, I'm just a fan. Like, I don't know anything. I just have fun talking about this show. I'm not gonna necessarily like pick a side. I think Mark says these were just jokes. I'm surprised that they fell this way. Well, if that was not your intention and Dan's your friend, like, and they were just like jokes to you, why not apologize? Instead, like Hochman in the oral history establishes the theme of like, I try to branch out and do things on my own, and Dan gets upset with that. And he does bring up a good point. Like, now everyone on the show is able to do like these things that I was never able to do. When I tried to do that, Dan got upset. And it's interesting, Mark's view on that. And I would say at the same time, though, like, I think he's not fully seeing, like, it seems like he sees Dan as this ego-filled person who didn't want Hochman taking away the limelight from him. And now things are, like, different for Dan. But I also, like, okay, if he was your friend and you found out you offended him through these jokes, like, what apology was offered to make that right? Because there's intentions and there's the actual results of what happened. You did not intend to disrespect Dan from these jokes, yet he did feel that way. So you apologize, right? You make things right. I don't know what was done in terms of that, because we get the parking lot fiasco the next day, where again there's a little bit of disagreement. Dan feeling like Hochman telling him, I'm responsible for your success. Marc Hochman doesn't feel like he said that, although I'd say, like, it's clear he had to have told Dan something along those lines, like, I'm responsible for the success of the show, and Dan interpreted it as, I'm responsible for your success. But Mark did not mean it that way. And going back to Dan, some interesting things. So I think there's sometimes that Mark's maybe not being fully honest with his role in it, and he's definitely hurt, and it kind of feels like he sees it. It feels like Mark thinks he did nothing wrong, but it takes two to make a relationship fall apart. What did you do to restore things from damages that you caused? What's interesting here, before I get to Dan, because I think Dan's doing some of the same things too. My thoughts, the Reddit was like, oh, isn't it kind of funny how Dan's relationship falls apart from Mark doing a stand-up comedy bit, with how much he talks stand-up comedy and they're so brave, and like Dan talks about roasts and stuff. If Dan had no idea that a roast was happening, it's totally different to show up to an event for your friend where you don't know you're going to get roasted, and all of a sudden you get roasted if there was never ever any permission given. Like, for all these Comedy Central roasts and Tom Brady roasts, like, permission is given and they know what they're signing up for. It doesn't sound like that was done. That's totally different to just show up and get roasted unaware. So you could actually understand if you didn't know it was coming, and now all of a sudden at this event you're the butt of like so many jokes, and some of them, again, that the build up to the Jack McKeon joke right after the Nevin Shapiro joke, like, there's just so much in there of that's like the setup, and the setup for the Nevin Shapiro joke is like, Dan, you're not this loyal person. And then it continues with Dan doesn't care about people, and the punchline has nothing to do with it after. He could have gotten to that punchline without it. So I could understand why Dan got offended and upset. Now, going to Dan. Dan does give some interesting responses in the oral history. Like, they ask him a couple times, like, how are you feeling about this? And Dan's response is, like, that's not how I think about myself. Like, I don't know if I was upset. I don't think I've ever thought of myself as someone who actively blocked it. But Dan was kind of missing the point of the question. Like, they were like, how were you feeling that they're doing these two-a-days? Like, were you upset? And clearly, Stu, like, felt that Dan was upset during that time at them doing the two-a-days. Dan was kind of misinterpreting. And Dan kind of several times gave like these non-answers, and instead couched it in this, like, that's not who I think of myself as. I feel differently, but not just answering like what were you feeling or doing during that time. And it's interesting that Dan would respond that way. That's not who I think of myself as. Where again, if you play the rest of that video, Dan says he was clapping above his head. He claps above his head one more time, and it's towards the very end of his set. So Dan clapped above his head, like he said, to support Hochman, but only during the introductions and only during another final joke. But that's what Dan thought he was doing. But in actuality, he wasn't clapping that much above his head because he wasn't feeling it, right? But that does go to show, like, that's what Dan thought he was displaying, like, support, but it really wasn't that much. Going back to then Dan saying, like, I thought I was supportive of it and doing all these things. And you get to how Hochman leaves the show. I thought that was very interesting, like Dan saying, oh, I was supportive of that. And yet the way in which Hochman left the show was pretty cold. Like, hey, you look tired. Why don't you go home? And you know what? You don't ever have to come back. And no goodbye show. Like, that's cold. That's disrespectful. And it's hard that, I mean, it comes to that. And Dan's response is like, I felt I was supportive of finding that. Like, you could have given Hochman like a goodbye show. Like, that was a pretty cold way to have Hochman leave the show. So I think with Dan, there's some non-answers and things as well. Ultimately, I mean, on Twitter, I think Mike has summed it up some of like coming down to some poor communication there. Like, Dan's thinking he's doing something, but Stu is obviously feeling that Dan's upset, and Dan's thinking he's being supportive, and there's all these tensions that are there, and friendship falls apart due to what Dan interprets as disrespect, where Mark is like, I was doing a character and doing a bit, and communication wise they missed each other. That's part of life. You know, sometimes there's miscommunications that continue on and don't get fixed. And you even see that later in the show where Mike's brought this up before, where he felt he had to interview his replacement, and Dan and Stu push back against that, saying like, we brought this guy in clearly to help you, and you were never at risk. And Mike's like, well, he thought he was the guy, and that made Mike feel a certain way. But Dan and Stu were like, no, you were never at risk, but Mike felt that way. Again, going back to like communication, which, I mean, I think honestly for us as fans, we've got no idea about the work behind the scenes, the hecticness of what it's like to put this show together for like over 20 years. Which is why I appreciate and like love the Le Batard Show, that they've been able to last this long and do the show so well and create such a creative and unique lane for themselves within sports podcasts. And too often I feel like fans don't appreciate that, like, because so many fans don't realize the amount of work that goes into it. Like, there's so many complaints of people on the Reddit about the show saying like, oh, they hardly ever work. They don't do anything. Like, there's so much behind the scenes that we don't understand and we don't comprehend, and the level of stress and hecticness and doing like something live for all that time, like it is draining. Like, it's draining to get in front of a microphone and talk, you know. I'm drained, and I've done it for I don't even know how long. You got no concept of time when you turn on a microphone. And now I'm here doing it alone, folks. The Fan Le Batard Show. Nasty Nate. Brian is on a hiatus. There's only myself remains, but I, Nasty Nate, will continue to bring you all your Le Batard Show stuff and more. And I'll continue to do it in a however I can type of way. Try my best to stay consistent, but I love the Le Batard Show. I'm not going anywhere. And I am looking forward to the next upcoming oral histories and whatever the Le Batard Show has left for us in the future. I'm going to ride this podcast into the future and on. Nasty Nate, this has been a oral history investigation. Nasty Nate signing out, ladies and gentlemen. Until next time, peace.